Welcome to the channel Liturgy of Slaves, Limestone County, Alabama, March 1857. A cold wind cut through the night when a choice was made by Reverend Calvin Fletcher that would mark him forever. He stood at the edge of his small wooden church, hands trembling, watching 12 shadows move through the darkness behind him. 12 souls who weren't supposed to exist as free people. 12 human beings he had just promised to lead toward something most folks called impossible. Freedom. His wife had begged him not to do it. His congregation had warned him. Even his own conscience whispered that a white preacher had no business getting mixed up in this kind of trouble. But something Calvin Fletcher had seen 3 weeks earlier burned a hole through his faith and forced him to ask a question that haunted his sleep. Could a man call himself a servant of God while turning his back on people who called out for mercy? That night, in a county where cotton was king and human beings were property, one preacher decided on his answer. What he didn't know was that his decision would set off a chain of events so brutal, so unforgiving, it would shake the conscience of everyone who heard about it. Because in Alabama, 1857, helping enslaved people escape wasn't just illegal. It was a sin white society could never forgive. And Calvin Fletcher was about to learn exactly what that meant. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. Alabama in 1857 wasn't a place where mercy lived comfortably. It was a place where fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved people, where the color of your skin determined whether you were human or property, and where questioning that arrangement could get you killed. Limestone County sat in the northern part of the state, close enough to Tennessee that some enslaved folks whispered about it as a possible route north. But close to Tennessee didn't mean safe. It meant more patrols, more suspicion, more white men with guns who saw their duty as protecting the peculiar institution at any cost. Calvin Fletcher wasn't born in Alabama. He'd come from Pennsylvania 15 years earlier, a young preacher full of fire and conviction, believing he could bring souls to Christ in the Deep South. He married a local woman named Margaret, built a small church for poor white farmers, and tried to fit into a world that felt foreign to everything he'd been taught about Christian love. For years, he kept his head down, preached about salvation and sin, avoided the subject everyone knew was tearing the country apart. But 3 weeks before that March night, Calvin witnessed something that changed him. At a neighboring plantation owned by a man named Cyrus Thornhill, he'd seen an enslaved woman named Sarah collapse in the field. She was pregnant 8 months along, and she'd been working since dawn. When she fell, the overseer didn't call for help. He called her lazy. He raised his whip, and when Calvin shouted for him to stop, the overseer looked at the preacher like he'd lost his mind. That night, Calvin couldn't pray, couldn't eat, couldn't pretend anymore that silence was godly. He'd spent his whole life preaching that every soul mattered to God. Now he had to decide if he really believed it. Cyrus Thornhill was the villain in this story, though he would have laughed at that description. To him, he was just a businessman. He owned 43 human beings, worked them hard, fed them little, and when they broke, he replaced them. Simple economics. Thornhill had pale eyes that never blinked and a reputation for cruelty that kept other plantation owners at a distance. Even in a world built on brutality, there were lines. Cyrus Thornhill crossed all of them. Calvin Fletcher didn't become a conductor on the Underground Railroad overnight. He became one in pieces, in small surrenders of the safety he'd built. First came the questions he asked himself in the dark. Then came the conversations with Margaret, who cried and held his hands and told him she was terrified of what might happen. Then came the moment he approached a free black man named Joseph Reed, a carpenter who lived on the edge of town, and whose eyes held secrets Calvin was only beginning to understand. Joseph didn't trust him at first. Why would he? White preachers talked a good game about Jesus, but most of them found ways to make peace with slavery. Some even preached it was God's will. So when Calvin showed up at Joseph's door one evening and said he wanted to help, Joseph studied him for a long time before speaking. "Help how?" Joseph asked. Calvin didn't have an answer yet. He just knew he had to do something. It was Joseph who explained how things worked. How there were routes, safe houses, signals. How enslaved people sometimes ran, and how there were folks, black and white, who risked everything to help them. Joseph told Calvin about Sarah, the pregnant woman he'd seen in Thornhill's field. He told him she'd lost 2 children already. He told him her husband had been sold south 6 months earlier. He told him she was planning to run as soon as she delivered her baby, because she'd rather die trying to reach free soil than watch another child grow up in chains. Calvin felt something break open inside him when he heard that. Some last piece of self-protection crumbled. He looked at Joseph and said something he couldn't take back. "Tell me what to do." What followed were weeks of careful planning. Joseph introduced Calvin to others in the network, people whose names the preacher never learned, whose faces he tried not to remember. They explained the routes, the timing, the dangers. They told him about patrols that rode at night, about dogs trained to hunt human beings, about laws that made helping a fugitive slave a federal crime. They told him that white people who got caught doing this work often faced mobs, tar and feathers, sometimes worse. They told him everything that could go wrong. Calvin listened to all of it. Then he said yes anyway. The plan came together in pieces. Sarah's baby came in late February, a tiny girl she named Grace. For 2 weeks, Sarah recovered enough to travel. Meanwhile, Joseph and the others identified 11 more people ready to run. They were field hands on 3 different plantations. People who'd been watching and waiting, people who understood this might be their only chance. The network sent word north, arranged safe houses, secured supplies, and Calvin opened his church. His church sat a quarter-mile from town, surrounded by woods. It had a small cellar that most people didn't know about, a space Calvin's predecessor had used for storing potatoes. Now it would hide human beings. Calvin spent a week preparing it, bringing in blankets, water, food. He didn't tell Margaret everything, but she knew. She watched him work with tears running down her face, knowing what he was doing, knowing what it might cost them. The night came faster than he expected. A message arrived at sunset. "They're coming tonight, be ready." Calvin stood in his church alone for an hour before they arrived, praying in a way he'd never prayed before. Not the formal prayers he'd learned in seminary, just raw, desperate. "Please, help me do this right. Keep them safe. Don't let me fail them." They came in silence, shadows moving through shadows. Joseph led them, and behind him came 12 people carrying nothing but hope and terror. Sarah held baby Grace, wrapped in a thin blanket. A man named Thomas walked with a limp from an old whipping. 2 teenage girls stayed close together, sisters named Ruth and Esther. An older man everyone called Uncle James moved slowly, favoring his left side where his ribs had been broken and never healed right. There were others, each carrying wounds Calvin couldn't see, each making a choice that took more courage than he could comprehend. He met them at the back door. Their eyes held questions. "Can we trust you? Will you really help us? Are you just another white man who will turn us in?" Calvin opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "You're safe here." Safe was a relative word. They had maybe 6 hours before people noticed they were gone. 6 hours before the alarm went up. 6 hours before every white man in 3 counties started looking for them. They climbed down into the cellar, moving carefully, trying not to make noise. Sarah held Grace close, whispering to her baby that everything would be all right, making promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Calvin brought them food, bread, dried meat, water. It wasn't much, but they ate like it was a feast. Some of them hadn't had a full meal in days. Others couldn't eat at all, too nervous, too afraid. Uncle James sat in the corner and closed his eyes, and Calvin couldn't tell if he was praying or just trying to breathe through the pain in his ribs. Margaret came down once. She looked at the faces in the cellar, at Sarah and baby Grace. at Ruth and Esther holding hands. Then she looked at Calvin, and he saw everything in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also something else. Pride, maybe, or recognition that the man she married was finally becoming the man he'd always claimed to be. She brought more blankets. She touched Sarah's shoulder. She whispered, "God be with you." Then she went back upstairs before she started crying in front of them. The plan was to wait until an hour before dawn, then move north in small groups. Joseph had arranged for wagons at 2 different locations. From there, they'd travel to safe houses in Tennessee, then keep pushing north. It was a route that had worked before, but every time was a gamble. Every mile was a risk. Every moment could be the one where everything fell apart. They waited. The cellar was cramped and cold. Baby Grace whimpered, and Sarah rocked her gently, terrified the sound would carry. Thomas checked his leg where the limp was worst, wondering if he could keep up. Ruth and Esther whispered to each other in voices so low Calvin couldn't hear the words. Uncle James just sat breathing slowly, like he was gathering himself for what came next. Calvin stayed upstairs watching the road. Every sound made his heart pound. Every shadow looked like a patrol. He'd never been so aware of his own fear, his own weakness. He was a preacher who'd spent his life talking about faith. And now he was discovering what faith actually cost. Around midnight, a rider came down the road. Calvin's stomach dropped. He watched through the window as the man slowed near the church, looked around, then kept going. Just a farmer heading home late. Nothing to do with them, but Calvin's hands shook for 10 minutes after. Margaret sat with him. She didn't say much, just sat close, letting him know he wasn't alone in this. They'd been married 12 years. They'd survived hard winters, crop failures, the judgment of people who thought a Pennsylvania preacher had no business in Alabama. But nothing had tested them like this. "If they catch us," Margaret said quietly, "they'll destroy everything." Calvin nodded. He knew the church would be burned. They'd be run out of town, maybe worse. Everything they'd built would be gone. "I know," he said. Margaret took his hand. "I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying I know what it costs, and I'm saying I'm with you." Calvin looked at his wife and felt something like grace wash over him. He wasn't doing this alone. Even in his fear, even in the darkness, he wasn't alone. 3 hours before dawn, Joseph returned. He moved through the woods like smoke, silent and careful. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once. "Their signal?" Calvin opened the door. "We have a problem," Joseph said. Calvin's blood went cold. What kind of problem? "Thornhill knows. Someone talked. He's got men on the roads north. They're checking every wagon, every traveler. They're looking specifically for Sarah." Of course they were. Sarah was valuable property to Cyrus Thornhill, a young woman who could bear children, who'd just proven she could survive childbirth despite everything. He wasn't going to let her walk away. Calvin looked at Joseph. "What do we do?" Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "We split up. Most of them go north as planned. Different routes, smaller groups. But Sarah and Grace, they can't travel that way. Not with a newborn. They'll never make it past the patrols. So what then? We hide them. Keep them here until things calm down. Then we try again." Calvin felt the weight of that decision. Keeping Sarah and Grace meant keeping them in danger. Every day they stayed was another day they could be discovered. But sending them out now meant sending them into Thornhill's arms. "How long?" Calvin asked. Joseph shook his head. "Could be a week, could be a month. There's no way to know." Calvin went down to the cellar. He looked at Sarah, at baby Grace, sleeping in her arms. He thought about what he was asking of her, to stay hidden, to wait, to trust that he wouldn't fail her. He knelt down beside her. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we need to change the plan." Her eyes widened. She knew what that meant. Calvin explained everything, the patrols, the danger, the choice they faced. He told her the others would leave as planned, but she and Grace would need to stay. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that would stay with Calvin for the rest of his life. "Reverend," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I've been enslaved my whole life, been beaten, been sold, been used like I wasn't human. I lost my babies, lost my husband, lost everything except this child in my arms. You asking me to trust you, a white man I don't hardly know, with our lives? That's a hard thing you asking." Calvin nodded. "I know." Sarah looked down at Grace, then back at Calvin. "But I seen something in you. Seen you stand up to that overseer. Seen you risk everything to bring us here. So I'm going to trust you, Reverend. I'm going to trust that God sent you to help us, and I'm going to wait." Calvin felt tears burn his eyes. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The others prepared to leave. Thomas, Ruth, Esther, Uncle James, and the rest. They gathered their few belongings, readied themselves for the journey. Joseph divided them into 3 groups, gave them directions, told them where to go. They would travel separately, take different routes, hope that splitting up would make them harder to catch. One by one, they climbed out of the cellar. One by one, they looked back at Sarah and Grace, at the woman and baby who had to stay behind. Some touched Sarah's shoulder. Others whispered prayers. They all understood what she was facing. Then they were gone, vanishing into the darkness before dawn. Calvin watched them go, Joseph leading the way, 12 souls risking everything for freedom. He prayed he'd done the right thing. Prayed they'd make it. Prayed he'd see them again in a world where they weren't property anymore. He went back down to the cellar where Sarah waited with Grace. The space felt bigger now, emptier. Just one woman and her baby hiding from a world that insisted they were things, not people. "How long you think?" Sarah asked. Calvin didn't lie to her. "I don't know, but I promise you I won't let them take you back." Sarah nodded. She looked at Grace, at her daughter's small face. "My mama used to tell me stories about freedom. Said there was a place up north where black folks could walk free, where nobody owned you. I never believed her. Thought it was just stories. But now I got this baby and I can't let her grow up like I did. I just can't." Calvin sat with them through the dawn. Margaret brought food. They kept the cellar dark and quiet. Upstairs, the world went on. Farmers passed on the road. Someone came to the church to ask if Calvin had seen anything suspicious during the night. He lied smoothly, said he'd slept through everything, hadn't heard a thing. The man looked at him suspiciously but left. By midday, word had spread through the county. 12 slaves had run from 3 different plantations. Cyrus Thornhill was offering a reward. Patrols were everywhere. White folks talked about nothing else. Calvin preached that Sunday like always. He stood in his pulpit and talked about mercy and judgment, about the narrow gate and the hard path. He looked at the faces in his congregation, farmers and their wives, people who owned no one but who lived in a world built on owning people. He wondered what they'd do if they knew what was hidden beneath their feet. After the service, Cyrus Thornhill himself appeared. He stood in the churchyard, pale eyes scanning everything, looking for something he sensed but couldn't see. He approached Calvin with a cold smile. "Reverend," Thornhill said, "I don't suppose you've heard anything about my missing property." Calvin met his eyes. "I've heard the talk. I'm sorry for your trouble." Thornhill studied him. "You Pennsylvania folks sometimes have peculiar ideas about property rights. I hope you understand how things work here." "I understand what the law says." "Good, because if I find out anyone helped my property escape, I'll see them hanged." Church or no church, Thornhill walked away, but Calvin felt the threat lingering in the air like smoke. This wasn't over, not by a long way. The days that followed were the longest of Calvin Fletcher's life. Each morning he woke wondering if this would be the day they were discovered. Each night he lay awake listening for sounds that didn't belong, for boots on the church steps, for voices calling out accusations. Sarah and Grace lived in the cellar like ghosts, barely making a sound, existing in a darkness that felt like a tomb. Margaret became their lifeline. She brought food 3 times a day, climbing down into that cold space with bread and water, and whatever else she could spare. She brought clean cloths for Grace, helped Sarah wash as best she could in a bucket of cold water. She never complained, never said what Calvin knew she was thinking, that every day was pushing them closer to disaster. Sarah didn't speak much those first days. She focused entirely on Grace, on keeping her baby quiet, on nursing her in silence, on surviving hour by hour. But on the fourth night, after Margaret had gone back upstairs, Sarah finally broke. "I can't do this much longer," she whispered to Calvin, who'd come down to check on them. "Being in the dark like this, not knowing if they're coming, not knowing if we'll ever get out, it's breaking something inside me." Calvin had no easy answers. He sat on the cold floor beside her and spoke the only truth he had. "I know this is hard. I know it's not the freedom you're running toward. But you're still here. You're still alive. Grace is alive. That's something." Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Is it though, Reverend? Is just being alive enough when you're living like this?" The question hung between them. Calvin thought about it long after he climbed back upstairs. Was survival enough, or did life require something more? Something that Sarah and Grace and millions of people like them had been denied. On the 6th day, Joseph returned with news. 10 of the 12 had made it to Tennessee. They'd split up as planned, traveled by night, hidden during the day. 2 different conductors had confirmed their arrival at safe houses. They were bruised, exhausted, but alive and moving north. "What about the other 2? Calvin asked, though he already knew the answer from Joseph's face, caught outside Huntsville, brought back in chains. "One of them was Thomas." Calvin closed his eyes. Thomas with his limp, who'd tried so hard to keep up. Thomas who'd risked everything. "Thornhill," he asked, bought them both back. "Word is he's making examples of them." They both knew what that meant. Public whippings, maybe worse. A message to anyone else thinking about running. Calvin went down to tell Sarah. She needed to know what was happening, what the stakes were. When he told her about Thomas, she didn't cry. She just held Grace tighter and stared at the wall. "That could have been me," she said quietly. "That could have been my baby, but it wasn't." "You're here, you're safe," Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Safe, that's a funny word for living in a hole in the ground. Calvin couldn't argue with that. The next weeks were a careful dance of deception. Calvin continued his normal life, preaching on Sundays, visiting the sick, performing his duties. But every moment felt like an act, a performance to convince the world he was just an ordinary preacher with nothing to hide. Thornhill's men came by twice more, searching the area, asking questions. Each time, Calvin's heart hammered in his chest. Each time they missed the cellar entrance, hidden beneath a loose board in the storage room. Margaret started showing the strain. She lost weight, developed dark circles under her eyes. People in town asked if she was ill. She smiled and said she was just tired, nothing more. But Calvin saw how her hands shook when she brought food to Sarah and Grace, saw how she flinched at unexpected sounds. The fear was eating her alive. Sarah, meanwhile, existed in a strange limbo. She'd escaped slavery, but wasn't free. She'd run, but was still trapped. Grace grew in that darkness, a baby who would never remember seeing the sun in her first weeks of life. Sarah sang to her quietly old songs her own mother had sung, songs about rivers and journeys and a promised land that seemed further away with each passing day. One night, Calvin came down to find Sarah standing, bouncing Grace gently, her face wet with tears. "She's sick," Sarah said. "I think she's got a fever." Calvin's stomach dropped. A sick baby crying could give them away. And more than that, Grace needed help they couldn't provide in a cellar. Margaret came down immediately. She touched Grace's forehead, felt the heat there. The baby was fussy, wouldn't nurse right, kept making small, distressed sounds. "We need to get her medicine," Margaret said. "Something to bring the fever down. If I go into town asking for baby medicine, people will ask questions," Calvin said. "Then we say it's for someone in the congregation. We make something up. And if someone wants to visit, wants to help." They looked at each other trapped. Every solution created new problems. Every choice carried risk. In the end, Calvin went to Joseph, explained the situation. Joseph nodded and said he'd get what they needed through the network. People who knew how to move supplies without raising suspicions. 2 days later, medicine arrived along with a message: they need to move soon. It's not safe to wait much longer. The medicine helped. Grace's fever broke, but the scare had shaken all of them. They couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, something would give. It almost gave on a Tuesday morning in late April. Calvin was in the church preparing Sunday's sermon when he heard horses, multiple riders, moving fast. He looked out the window and saw Thornhill leading 6 men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. Calvin's blood turned to ice. He thought about Sarah and Grace down in the cellar, about Margaret upstairs in their small house beside the church. He thought about everything they'd done, everything they'd risked, and he thought about what would happen if Thornhill found them. He met the men outside, blocking the church door with his body. "Mr. Thornhill, gentlemen, what brings you here?" Thornhill's pale eyes were hard as stone. "We got word you might be harboring fugitives, Reverend. We're here to search the premises." Calvin's heart was pounding so hard he was sure they could hear it. "On whose authority? On my authority. I've got a legal right to recover my property, and I've got reason to believe you're interfering with that right." "What reason? That's my business. Now step aside." Calvin didn't move. He thought about what Thornhill would do to Sarah, what he'd do to Grace, what he'd do to Calvin and Margaret for hiding them. And he thought about all those sermons he'd preached about standing up for what was right, about being willing to suffer for righteousness' sake. Now he had to decide if he'd meant any of it. "I can't let you search my church without proper legal authority," Calvin said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is a house of God. It deserves respect." One of Thornhill's men moved forward, hand on his gun. The preacher's got a mouth on him. Thornhill held up a hand, stopping the man. He studied Calvin for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was the coldest smile Calvin had ever seen. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Reverend. I haven't decided which, but I'll tell you this once. If I find out you've been helping slaves run, there's no church in the world that'll protect you. You understand me? I understand that I'm a minister of the gospel, and this is my church." Thornhill stared at him, the moment stretched out taut as a wire. Calvin waited for the man to push past him to search the church to find the cellar. He waited for everything to fall apart. Instead, Thornhill turned his horse. "Search the woods around here," he told his men. "Check every building within a mile, and if you find anything, you bring them to me. Alive if possible, dead if necessary." They rode off, fanning out through the surrounding area. Calvin watched them go, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. They'd come so close, so terribly close. He went inside and sat in a pew, shaking. After a few minutes, Margaret appeared. She'd seen everything from the house window. She sat beside him and took his hand. "We can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "It's going to kill us or get us killed. I know. So, what do we do?" Calvin looked at the altar, at the cross hanging above it. He thought about all those years of preaching, all those words about faith and courage. He thought about Sarah singing to Grace in darkness. He thought about Thomas being dragged back in chains. "We get them out," he said. "Soon as it's safe, we get them north. And if it's never safe," Calvin didn't have an answer for that. Joseph came that night with a new plan. The attention had died down in Tennessee. The safe houses were ready. They had a wagon leaving in 3 days, heading north with legitimate cargo. There was space in back, hidden space where 2 people could hide. It was risky, but it was the best chance they were going to get. Sarah received the news with a mixture of relief and terror. 3 more days in cellar, then a journey more dangerous than anything she'd faced so far. But it was movement. It was progress toward the freedom she'd been promised since the day she ran. Those last 3 days felt endless. Every sound was a threat. Every moment was weighted with the knowledge of how much could still go wrong. Sarah prepared herself mentally, talking to Grace like the baby could understand, telling her stories about where they were going, about the life they'd have when they finally reached free soil. Calvin spent those days in prayer, real prayer, not the formal kind, but the desperate kind. He asked God to protect them, asked for strength, asked for mercy. He'd spent his whole ministry talking about God's love, and now he needed that love to be real, tangible, powerful enough to carry a woman and baby through dangers he could barely imagine. The night before they were to leave, Sarah asked Calvin a question that cut straight to his heart. "Reverend," she said, "why'd you do this? Risk everything for people you don't even know?" Calvin thought about it. He thought about that day in Thornhill's field, watching Sarah collapse, watching the overseer raise his whip. He thought about all those sermons about loving your neighbor, about treating others as you'd want to be treated. He thought about standing in front of God someday and having to explain what he'd done with his life. Because it was right, he said simply. Because I couldn't call myself a Christian and not do it. Sarah nodded slowly. Most white preachers don't see it that way. I know, but I figure if my Jesus turned over tables for people selling doves, he wouldn't mind me hiding folks trying to be free. Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. It was a small smile, tentative, like she'd almost forgotten how, but it was there. The wagon came. At midnight, Joseph drove it with another man Calvin didn't know riding beside him. They pulled up to the church quietly. No lanterns, no unnecessary noise. Calvin brought Sarah and Grace up from the cellar into fresh air they hadn't breathed in over a month. Sarah stood for a moment, just breathing, looking at stars she hadn't seen since she ran. Grace, wrapped in blankets, made small sounds. Didn't cry. Margaret pressed a bundle into Sarah's hands. Food, extra clothes, a bit of money. For when you get there, she whispered, for your new life. Sarah looked at Margaret, at this white woman who'd fed her, helped her, kept her secret. Thank you, she said. And those two words carried more weight than any sermon Calvin had ever preached. They loaded Sarah and Grace into the hidden compartment. It was cramped, barely enough space for a grown woman and baby. Sarah would have to stay absolutely silent, absolutely still for hours, maybe days, depending on how the journey went. Calvin saw the fear in her eyes as they closed the compartment, saw her clutching Grace, and he felt like his heart was being torn out. God go with you, he said quietly, not sure if she could even hear him. Then they were gone. The wagon pulled away into darkness, carrying two souls towards something that might be freedom, or might be capture, or might be death. Calvin stood in the road watching, until he couldn't see them anymore, until there was nothing but darkness and the sound of his own breathing. Margaret came and stood beside him. She was crying. Calvin realized he was too. They went inside and waited. There was nothing else to do, just wait and pray and hope that somewhere up north Sarah and Grace would find the life they'd been promised. Days passed, then weeks, no word came. Calvin went about his duties, preached his sermons, visited the sick, but part of him was always elsewhere, traveling with Sarah and Grace in his imagination, hoping they were safe. Thornhill stopped coming around. Whether he'd given up or just moved on to other concerns, Calvin didn't know. The search died down. Life in Limestone County returned to its usual rhythm, built on the backs of people who had no choice. Then 2 months later, a letter arrived. It had been passed through multiple hands, multiple stops on the Underground Railroad, carefully avoiding names or anything that could be traced, but Calvin recognized Joseph's handwriting underneath someone else's words. The package arrived safely, 2 items, both in good condition. They are with friends now, learning to live in their new home. The woman asks that you know her daughter will grow up free. She will never know chains, and that is because of you. Calvin read the letter 3 times, then he folded it carefully and burned it in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken. No evidence, no trail, just the knowledge that Sarah and Grace were free. That Sunday, he preached about the Exodus, about Moses leading people out of slavery, about a promised land, about the courage it takes to walk away from bondage even when you don't know what's ahead. He preached it like he'd never preached before, with tears running down his face, with his whole heart exposed. Some people in his congregation shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at him with new understanding, like they were finally seeing who he really was. A few even came up afterward and pressed his hand, saying nothing but communicating everything in that simple gesture. Calvin Fletcher continued his work. In the 2 years that followed, he helped 7 more people escape to freedom, always working with Joseph, always risking everything. Some of them made it north, one didn't, caught by patrols and returned to a fate Calvin couldn't bear to think about, but he kept working, kept believing that every life saved mattered, that every person who reached freedom justified the risk. The war came in 1861, and with it everything changed. The institutions that had seemed permanent crumbled. The people who'd seemed like property became soldiers, citizens, free human beings. Calvin Fletcher lived to see emancipation, lived to see the world he'd fought against in secret finally destroyed in public. He never saw Sarah and Grace again, never knew exactly where they ended up, what names they took, what lives they built. Underground Railroad worked because people didn't know too much, couldn't tell what they didn't know, but sometimes in his later years he'd sit in his church and imagine a young woman somewhere up north, free and whole, raising a daughter who knew nothing about being owned. He'd imagine that daughter growing up strong, maybe even having children of her own, starting a lineage of free people whose freedom began in a cellar beneath a small Alabama church. He died in 1869, an old man worn out by years of fear and faith, by the constant tension of living a double life. Margaret was with him. At the end, they never had children of their own, but in a way they'd helped birth something larger, the freedom of souls they'd never see again. On his gravestone, someone carved a simple phrase. He risked everything, no explanation, no context, just those 3 words to mark a life that had chosen courage over comfort, righteousness over safety. And somewhere in a place Calvin never knew, a woman named Sarah told her daughter Grace about the white preacher who'd hidden them when everyone else would have turned them in, who'd given them a chance at life. That story passed down through generations, carried in memory, a reminder that even in the darkest times, some people still choose light.